Okay, well, it's just after 9 o'clock, so hello everyone. On behalf of the PHRN, I'd like to warmly welcome you to the first Linkage Luminaries webinar for 2023. My name is Merryn Smith, and I'm the Chief Executive of the PHRN. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all the lands that we're meeting on today and paying my respects to elders past and present. First, some housekeeping. If you have any questions for today's speaker, please type them in the Q&A box at any time during the presentation. We'll answer as many questions as possible after the presentation. The presentation is being recorded and we'll make it available on the PHRN YouTube channel as soon as possible after the webinar. So I'm delighted to introduce Professor David Roeder as today's presenter. Professor Roeder is the South Australian Cancer Council's Beat Cancer Research Chair of Cancer Epidemiology and Population Health at the University of South Australia. He also works under contract with Cancer Australia, Cancer Institute New South Wales and Canteen. Professor Roeder has had a long and distinguished career in cancer research and has authored over 400 peer-reviewed publications. He's also been a WHO consultant and advisor to governments in Australia and overseas. He's chaired numerous national advisory committees and served as a member on many more. Professor Roeder's research interests abroad with a focus on cancer, health services evaluation, safety and quality, and data infrastructure development. So today's presentation is focused on how research using linked data is driving improvements in cancer care. We're really looking forward to it. So over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Merryn. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands on which we sit and their elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledging the duration over which they have had that association with the land. I must say that I appreciate very much the privilege to be able to talk on my favourite subject. Often I'm bashing on doors to get somebody to listen. So it's wonderful to actually be invited. It did cross my mind that maybe there was another David Roeder that they were after. But look, I'll take the opportunity now to ear bash you for a little while. So my talk is about producing high quality data in a federation. And we all know what that means: robust jurisdiction, robust public sector and private sector, the use of data for lots of purposes, for science, for budgetary horse trading, all sorts of things. All of this enters into the environment in which we're working and seeking access to data. So the first screen here shows what my subject is: the benefits of linked cancer data for extending data availability for both cancer monitoring and research, and also for supporting administrative services, administration services. So if I could have, before we go further, I'd like to acknowledge the advisors that are listed on the right-hand side of this slide. These advisors come from every population-based registry in Australia, from Cancer Australia, and from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. So I've had lots of advice, but if I make a mess of this, it's my responsibility, not theirs. So I'll talk today on major data developments that are occurring in Australia for cancer control. This is really not rocket science, I have to say. It's a workable framework that is fully operational in part of the country and moving towards being effectively operational elsewhere in the country. Its performance stands to be improved, I think, with improvements in information technology and administrative processes, and I'll come to those later. So if I could have the next slide, please. The purpose of cancer data collection in Australia is many, but it includes showing population-wide disparities in cancer incidence, mortality, survival, and prevalence, and doing that by cancer type, usually classified by the site of the cancer in the body, as well as its histology type, and to show the way forward for service planning and priority setting based on those data, for monitoring service delivery and cancer pathways, for quality improvement initiatives, and these have been crucial, I must say, in the area of screening for showing interval cancers and allowing evaluation of screening sensitivity, to address environmental concerns. Environmental concerns, I remember back in the 80s, seem to be with us all the time. They don't appear to be quite as frequent now, and of course they still exist. And when they come from the consumer end, from the public end, they come with a lot of worry and quite a lot of ferocity, I must say. So even though they're not common, that when they arrive, we need to be ready for them. But also to support population health and health services research. So the next slide, thanks. By way of context, Australia, as we all know, is a federation of 8 states and territories. The overall population is 26 million, and each state and territory has a legislatively mandated population-based cancer registry. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare in Canberra compiles and analyses the data that come from these population-based registries, and that allows us to get national data, which we've had now for the last 40 years, since the very early stages in the 1980s. So very much a collective effort by registries, and I'd like to acknowledge the Australasian Association of Cancer Registries that represents the operators of these registries on the ground. Many of them work tirelessly without a lot of recognition, but their work is so fundamental, and they need to be involved in planning because they can see the operational possibilities close up. So if we could go to the next slide, thanks. So this compilation of data by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, which is necessary to get the population view of all of Australia, is based on a minimum data set, but it really is quite minimal. There are only 13 data items which are shown on the left-hand side of this slide. This minimal approach reflects the priority given to national coverage when these registries were first established and were underway. And this was so from the outset, rather than focusing on data depth and detail, which we felt would create, in those days, an excessive burden and would threaten durability of those registries. It also reflected the IT availability in the late 70s, early 1980s, which falls far short of what it is today. So that's what we have. The data outputs have been adequate to show incidence, mortality, survival, prevalence by cancer type across the population. And it's been routine to present these outputs by age, sex, area, socioeconomic status at the sort of level equivalent to SA2, I suppose, by geographic region, by country of birth, by Indigenous status, although the recording of Indigenous status has not been good over the years. It's getting better, that it has hindered getting accurate data on First Nations people in this country, and also by diagnostic year, so we can see if things are getting better or worse. The next slide, thanks. However, the demand for cancer data at a population level has increased remarkably in Australia. And that's not just in Australia. I hear from my colleagues in North America and the UK, and certainly around Asia, that more and more people want data. And I guess the push for evidence-based planning and evaluation, as well as the use for research, is driving that increase in demand. but the demand comes from service planning, people, from service administrations in relation to quality improvement initiatives, those environmental interests that I mentioned earlier, and for a whole range of research applications. And I would like to highlight population-wide, health service-wide research as part of that, but the applications extend certainly into clinical and other spheres of research. So this slide shows the directions that are being pursued to collect these data. And as I've said, we have extensive linked data in some jurisdictions, particularly the larger ones, but also the development occurring along these lines, I would say, in all jurisdictions to varying extents. The data sources include the population-based cancer registries. They have a small box at the bottom of this slide, which understates their value as the linkage spine to which all these other data sources are linked. And these other data sources include hospital inpatient data, emergency department data, data from radiotherapy centres, MBS and PBS claims, increasingly patient-reported outcomes. Certainly in New South Wales, that is becoming quite well developed now. It was initially based on the Edmonton scale, but that is being routinely collected and now factored into the data linkage, along with the other data to which I've referred. Also linking to vaccination data like HPV vaccination, the screening registers. Just like to add that screening registers now are located partly at a state level, I refer to breast screen, or at a national level, I refer to cervical screening and bowel screening. And so this highlights the need around the country to be able to access data across jurisdictional boundaries on the population within jurisdictions. So it does indicate the challenges there and the importance of data linkage. Another recent addition to the linkage suite of linkage resources is the ABS MADIT data, which we see in the lower right-hand corner. This includes census data as well as Centrelink data and education, welfare data of various types. Amazing source of data on the social determinants of cancer and the social determinants of care pathways as well. So all of these come together to give almost a holistic view, I would say, of cancer and its clinical management and its social determinants. These linkage systems are being extended in some states and territories to also include biospecimens and genomic databases, which are located at the top of that slide. Clinical cancer registries that we're hearing a lot about at the moment also have been linked into some state and territory linkages, and they are extremely valuable to enable us to drill down and get more detailed analyses for the cancers they cover. They do allow data validation of data that are used by population-based registries that come from administrative sources and are being used to ensure we have population-wide coverage. So where you have groups of individuals that are covered by both the clinical registries and the population registries, the clinical registries can be used to validate. And I must say the population registries can be used to indicate back to the clinical registries how representative or non-representative their client groups are of the population more generally. Excuse me. So this linked data system is almost complete in New South Wales, for example, and certainly very advanced in the other larger states, less so in the smaller states and territories. In South Australia, though, it's been used to cover breast cancers, prostate cancers, colorectal cancers, and cancers in the Indigenous population, or cancers in the Indigenous population, drawing on databases in South Australia at a Commonwealth level. So the system that we have is working and bringing the data in so it can be analysed, but it's still in a stage that I would call a clunky stage that needs refinement by way of process. So if we could go to the next slide, thanks. Slide 6. So the population-based cancer registries, along with their data linkages, can be extended to include data on stage and non-stage prognostic indicators, on care pathways, on progression and recurrence. I need to qualify that area because it's still in a developmental phase. A lot of work going on in New South Wales and in Queensland in that regard, and I think in other states and territories probably as well, but that really hasn't fully arrived yet. Also to look at side effects of toxicities in the short term, we can do that now. In the long term, we have to wait until these data systems are more mature, but certainly of some value, I think, the new novel therapies that are well researched before they're released, but following them over the decades to see if there are late effects and other long-term toxicities. I've referred to patient-reported outcome measures, and there's also the issue of comorbidity and multimorbidity that bears so strongly on the care that is provided. And so the data we have can be used with Charlson Index or RX Risk Index, other indices of morbidity, and also the demographic descriptors to which I referred. In particular, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we can use census data and other data in the ABS to identify that population in our cancer registry, so that they're identified in exactly the same way as in the underlying population, and we can get valid rates. Until now, we often obtain the numerators and the denominators from different sources, which does lend itself to distortion and bias. Cord populations, we have a huge range of cultures in this country, and they're not homogeneous, as we all know. So again, with the ABS data, we can better define these groups and better measure cancer rates and how they're being managed, because we have the population data aligned with the numerator data. Socioeconomic status, we've all heard of CEPA, we've all used it. It's an area measure that is served us well, but it's a fairly blunt tool. And so with the linked data through the so-called MADIT program that's provided by the ABS, we can get down to household level and so on, and really have a view of disparities in socioeconomic status that are harsher than if they're averaged out over areas. So if we could have the next slide, please. So Australia has a network of mostly government-funded data linkage units, and all states and territories have access to a linkage unit. We see so many of them there, and that again reflects the structure of this country, with very strong jurisdictions, and so we tend to build the data up rather than having a central linkage unit to link everybody. So that's what we have now. If I could have the next slide, thanks. I must say that those linkage units have very clear guidelines and standards, and they are credentialed, the ones that are used, and so they go about their business in a very professional way to protect privacy. After the data have been linked, these units create linkage keys, and the data are added without names, obviously, and other clear identifiers, but with linkage keys to remote access data laboratories where they're stored in de-identified form. These are remote access data laboratories so that people can analyze the data without actually taking the data out of that secure laboratory environment. So that is another protection for privacy. And it's also the data also curated on the way out independently by a human to make sure that there are no breaches in privacy. I mention this because privacy is such a big thing these days, and there have been breaches, not with our system, but we see it in the press in various commercial and political environments. So it's important that this system is as foolproof as it can be. And so far, no incidents have occurred to my knowledge. It does mean that we have to follow rules that get in the way of research sometimes, like cell sizes, accesses to data in small areas where we have an interest and a concern. So it's a matter of getting the balance right between the quality of the research we're doing and the protection of privacy. So if I go over the next slide, thanks. So the result of all this linkage is greatly increased scope of data to support patient care services and, as I said, research, particularly population and health services research. So the next slide, please. So this is a somewhat ancient, it's becoming now, study of survival across Australia. It's holistic. There were no groups excluded here. And in this study, we looked at 5 leading cancer sites that you can see in the table at the bottom. And we looked at them by TNM stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, that TNM stage 1, 2, 3, 4 was developed, or Cancer Australia auspiced the activity. It was developed through the Australasian Association of Cancer Registries and the National Cancer Control Indicator Program of Cancer Australia. It was developed so that it could be done everywhere. One of the issues we face is that registries live in different parts of the country, in different environments, and we had to have an approach to TNM staging that was doable by all the registries, and that's what was developed. Victoria played a very strong role in shepherding that through, but all registries made a huge contribution. Couldn't have been done otherwise. And we see the expected reductions in survival, irrespective of site, from stage 1, which is localized, to stage 4, where we're talking mostly about distant metastatic disease, a diagnosis. So it all looks like it should look. So it has face value validity. If I could go to the next slide, thanks. So using this stage, this homegrown stage process that was developed, we call it registry-derived stage. We've used that in various studies, and this is just one that we did in South Australia, looking at breast cancer stage distribution. And it looked at data for 2000 to 2014, retrospectively staged. And we see the stage in the top row from 46% for stage 1 to 4% for stage 4. And look how similar it is to the next rows down for Australia in a different year, 2011, Canada for 2013, UK, England for 2012, almost the same figures. So it has been useful to be able to do that, looking at breast cancer in this case. And we need to be looking at a range of other cancers, obviously, as well. The key to being able to do this as a population level is having consistency in the way you measure stage across geographically and over time. And that is in contradistinction to clinical practice, where staging will change as it needs to change to improve patient care, taking on board new knowledge. So there is a tension we've got to deal with there in trying to have relevant data at a population level that obeys the rules of epidemiology, so it's got meaning, and at the same time talks the language of the clinicians and others in care, so that it has meaning for them too. So for adults, RDT, it's called registry derived TNN. That was the staging system we developed. There's a common metric and crafted to be usable, as I said, in all states and territories. In Australia, it's equivalent really to what has been done in the US through CS summary stage, or in Europe through essential or condensed TNN. Very common, also common metrics and for similar purposes. So if I could go to the next slide, slide 12. But for children, we have to break ranks with RD stage because childhood cancers are classified more by morphology. So we have a different staging system there, tier Toronto staging. And I think we need to acknowledge Queensland for its contribution to this international effort in coming up with international staging for pediatric cancers. Tailored they are to population registry needs. So we have here staging of common cancers, but we're 95% of them through the whole country. Here were major cancer types, pediatric ones, the stage. And we use tier 2 Toronto guidelines. And these are guidelines that are achievable by countries that have the adequate capacity to do that with their infrastructure. There's also tier 1, which is more doable across the whole globe, so that we can look at global epidemiology and not just be reliant on those often more affluent countries that have the better structured registries and can work at tier 2 level. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So this was really sort of cutting edge using the Toronto staging population wide in Australia because it was hot off the press, and it was done at the population level here. And again, Queensland played a strong role in that because of their involvement in the development of the Toronto guidelines internationally. But what we do see is particularly survival being lower for childhood cancers with the most advanced Toronto stages, that is the stages to the right-hand side, which indicate some face value validity, I think, of our application of those guidelines by our registries in Australia. So if I could go to the next slide, thanks. So returning to adult cancers, just showing the utility of registry-derived stage. This was a South Australian study. It was used to investigate outcomes of breast cancer. We use competing risk regression for breast cancers to show subhazard ratios after stage adjustment. So this is after stage adjustment. And what these data, first of all, it was very doable. I mean, we did it retrospectively back to the year 2000. It was not difficult to apply RD stage retrospectively. And predictably, it showed higher mortality for ages of 70 years and over a diagnosis, which is very likely to reflect comorbidity and frailty and the less intensive treatment provided for older Australians. It also showed lower mortality for more recent diagnostic periods. No, if we could go back to the previous slide now. We've jumped ahead. There you go. It also showed lower mortality for the more recent diagnostic periods. You can see the subhazard ratio down at 0.75 and 0.57 for the more recent periods there. And I think this potentially reflects, at least in part, treatment advances that are occurring and other advances. But also we see lower mortality for the least disadvantaged areas or the higher socioeconomic areas. And this points to an equity issue in Australia that we need to tackle, and hopefully future analyses will show that that will start to close that difference. On the other side of the coin, we found it reassuring from an equity perspective. The differences were not seen by country of birth or residential remoteness. In Australia, given the diversity of people living in Australia and Australians with different countries of birth, different cultural backgrounds, and how remote some of our residential areas are, these global figures were somewhat reassuring. So the key to these analyses was having registry-derived stage as an epidemiological tool that was doable. And it's important to validate this homegrown staging system. And several studies have been done to do that. So could we go back to slide 15 now, thanks? Or go forward, there we are. This slide includes results from a New South Wales study done using New South Wales Cancer Registry data. And it showed the alignment of RD stage in red font there with AJCC-TNN, which is a system that is used commonly in clinical practice. And so we can look there at the concordance and we can look at the kappa scores. And you can see that these scores were generally very high for RD stage, not so high for prostate. I understand there's an explanation for that, but it escapes me at the moment. The alignment appeared to be stronger than for degree of spread, which is a more rudimentary way of looking at stage. It's only applied at a population level in New South Wales and the ACT. A similar study looking at alignment and concordance done in South Australia came up with similar results, but focused only on colorectal cancer and breast cancer in that particular situation. So the next slide, thanks. Despite complexities, we feel that headway is being made with stage applications for population-wide registries and population-wide epidemiological purposes. We're currently reviewing options for RD stage as new IT opportunities are emerging and new data accesses are emerging. And so we are looking at how we can improve that process, but RD stage still is very useful and has already been particularly useful with those past examples. We're also, though, aware of the increasing use of non-stage prognostic indicators, and this likely will increase in response to more genetic and other molecular research. And some of those indicators are listed here. Some population-based registries are including some of these, but this still is in its very infancy, but is in the target site. We want to keep talking the language of the drivers of clinical practice at a population level, and certainly this is an emerging area. So next slide, thanks. So what are the next steps in data development to support service delivery in Australia? And I've put question marks next to that. I think it's gaining better data on stage and on stage prognostic indicators across our population-based registry. I think it's extending data linkage to include immunisation and other treatment data. And I point here to clinical registries. I think clinical registries are of value, population registries are of value. They play a complementary role. 1 and 1 comes to more than 2 if you look at them collectively. I think also linking to additional social determinants, and I've referred to some of those in relation to the ABS, both determinants of cancer itself and of care pathways. So this, I think, will enable identification of disparities across the screening treatment pathway at a national level, as is already occurring in the larger states. I think New South Wales has probably got about as far down the track as it's possible to get. Maybe a bit more to be done on patient-reported outcomes, and other larger states are right up there as well. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, the next steps for data development to support research, again with question marks, in my opinion, are linkage to biospecimen data, to genetics and molecular data, geospatial and environmental data, data from electronic medical records, local health networks, primary health networks, national health surveys, which are also linked in with the MADE ABS platform, so that it's got access to national health survey data there, and also data on occupation and employment data. So moving on to the next slide. So another question is the likely utility of these lake data to assess the side effects of treatment exposures in the short term, but more particularly in the long term, which we can't look at until the long term has occurred, because we have information there from the population registries that are holistic in terms of coverage of the population. We've got the hospital data, the MBS, PBS data, we've got death records, and we've got other data being linked in. Now, this work has already been done on a small scale in preliminary studies with useful outcomes. So I think in the future, we could see that these linked data could be used as an alert system to pick up on side effects or late effects that are occurring before they make their way through the literature and are picked up around the world. So the next slide, please. Of course, population cancer registries have already been used in many environmental cancer studies. And here's just 20 examples that I picked out quickly that are in the literature. So we're not unfamiliar with that sort of work. Next slide, please. The literature also shows the potential treatments to be carcinogenic in some of the cancers resulting from treatment exposures that have been listed there. They're just 10 examples. The next one, please. And here are some of the agents, past and present, that have been linked to carcinogenic effects. So next slide. And of course, there are also non-carcinogenic effects of treatment. We do treatment because there's an overwhelming benefit compared with the side effects. That isn't to say there are no side effects. So there are just some, I think, 10 or so non-carcinogenic outcomes. Quite a lot of publicity recently in terms of cardiovascular effects of chemotherapies, for example, pediatric cancers, long-term emergence of heart problems would be another example of that. There are many benefits to be gained. If I can just look at the next slide, please. There are many benefits to be gained from linking population registry data to other registries and administrative databases. Some examples listed here have been supporting service delivery, looking at coverage of services, timeliness of services, mapping care pathways, looking at outcomes, looking at reach across the population, rural areas, low socioeconomic areas amongst the Aboriginal population, poor population, and so forth. Also, the next one, extending, exploring carcinogenic effects of cancers and non-carcinogenic effects. And when fully developed, this could be part of an alert system, in my view. I'd be particularly interested in its use for new and very expensive novel treatments that are probably going to gain momentum, I would think, with the molecular research and genetic research that's underway. such systems, where they're feasible, I think provide local value to the communities those systems serve, but also contribute to worldwide knowledge for more general applications. So just before I finish up on this, I'd just like to have several addendums. The first addendum is the challenge we have in getting timely access to linked data. There are no negative inferences here to those units that do that work. The task is much larger and more complex than most people realise, but we do need to speed it up as much as we can. We have a linked data framework that works, so data are available beyond instance mortality, survival and prevalence. They do include stage, comorbidity, screening, treatment pathways, side effects, and even patient-reported outcomes getting in there now. Immediate challenge is how to gain more timely access to linked data. It can take at least 2 years at the moment to get a complete linked data from time of request. But the timeline is much shorter and the access is more immediate where we have an enduring linked data set. And these data sets, where updated periodically, can be used to extract data more quickly. I see this as the way to go, and I have to point out that the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare is already going in that direction, so it's not a novel thought of mine. Also, we need to streamline as best we can the multi-jurisdictional processes. So many ethics committees, so many administrative committees, often needing to be addressed in a linear fashion, which stretches out timelines, limits what we can do quickly. But the key steps are those enduring data linkages, streamlining those ethics and administrative pathways. I think prioritising projects, if we don't have the resources to do everything, not leaving people on the end of the queue forever, but making hard decisions about which ones we're going to do in the national interest. Better still, increasing the available resources, of course. Establishing large multi-person linked platforms that are regularly updated and where extracts can be used for multiple purposes. I think increasing access of regular users through special training and credentialing to get less restricted access to linked data. I think while that is already occurring to some degree, we need to move further, I think, towards the concept of a data commons and handling that in a safe way. Also, we need to take advantage of the new IT opportunities that are out there. It's long since the pen and paper days of the early 80s when our registries got moving. So that's the first addendum. The second one is a challenge of supporting and being supported by clinical registries. We should not think of those population registries and clinical registries as if they live on different planets. They have complementary roles with the population-based registry, showing the big picture across the whole population, and clinical registries having that drill down capacity to look at systems in greater detail. I think ideally, as I've said, clinical registries should be part of the broader linkage so that we can use the data from both sources for better outcomes and for better research. It's obvious that many clinical registries have to forfeit population reach to have the drill down detail for the more in-depth quality improvement research they undertake. The third addendum is a challenge of having appropriate national leadership and governance. I'm not, again, casting aspersions on national bodies and national leadership entities. It's just that with so many jurisdictions, public sector, private sector, we do really, I think, need to strengthen the governance arrangements we have so we can bring all these data together, because it's not an easy business for a researcher or an individual service administrator to bring these data together. I think also to the need to use population registries for early detection of mass disruptive events and how they impact on cancer control. We've just gone through and still going through the COVID experience. That is one example And others would be, of course, the floods, the fires, and heaven forbid we have the earthquakes that they're having now in Turkey and Syria. In that way, if we can use registries, use semi-processed data in the same way communicable disease control units use data that doesn't pretend to be complete in terms of incidence, but good enough to see a disruptive event, where it's doing the most damage and what needs to be done about it. I think that's a role that our cancer registries and linked data can serve as well. As I finish, I just want to acknowledge again the great work done in the cancer data development by our population registries, by their little organisation, the Australasian Association of Cancer Registries. It's small in size, but it's big in understanding of what's feasible on the ground. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, we wouldn't have the national data that we've had for almost 40 years now, were it not for the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. Cancer Australia for its strategic input and for its funding of demonstration projects to get this sort of work done. The clinicians who have to find space in their lives to contribute data, and of course to our jurisdictions, our states and territories for their contributions. So thanks everyone for listening to me.
Thank you very much, David, for a fabulous presentation that covered an enormous amount of ground and certainly highlighted some challenges for me in our role at PHRN. Now, there is an opportunity for people to put questions into the Q&A, and at the moment we don't have any questions, so I encourage people to put their fingers on their keyboards and just feel free to ask anything or make a comment if you prefer. So, David, I do have a question, and I think
before we go further, Naren, I forgot to acknowledge the PHRN. So can I give a belated apology for that and acknowledge the PHRN? It did fabulous work in multi-jurisdictional linkages, and I remember all the meetings we had with consumers and everything else. So it played a big role. And it's a sin that I've omitted to mention until now.
Never mind, David. I think you did put up that slide of the data linkage units, and of course, when PHRN started, there were only two in the two jurisdictions had linkage units, and there was one in Canberra. Now, as you said, the good news is that all jurisdictions are able to link their population data. But as you were speaking, what did occur to me was that there are many, many things that need to be done. And I'm just wondering, do you have any priorities? Is there anything in particular, or one or two things that you think that we should be focusing on in the short to medium term to try and address some of those challenges that you've identified?
Well, if I could start at a small picture end and end on a larger picture end. At a small picture end, I think there is still more work to be done on staging and much more work to be done on non-stage prognostic indicators. It's one thing to produce survival differences and disparities across the population. It's another thing to work out whether the system more or less inherited some of those difficulties through advanced stage when people came, or whether it relates to the treatment end, and that does bear on what you do about it. So I think those two areas at a small picture end, a large picture in terms of effort, a small picture in other ways, would be my immediate priorities. I think RD stage has been and continues to be very effective at a all of Australia level. There's no other staging system that we've tried out at an all of Australia level. But I think we can look, as the world evolves and the opportunities evolve, on improving on RD stage. So if we don't see something that is stuck in granite. At a larger end, I think it's the governance of the system. I think we've got so many different groups involved in cancer data provision and cancer data processing and we all have to work in some degree of alignment if we're going to have useful national data. And so I know Cancer Australia is working in that area. I know Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, and I will include PHN, not forget PHN this time. But I think that it is really important that there is robust national governance so that we have robust national data. Perhaps if I could just say one further thing, which I've already mentioned, I think we have population-based registries allow us to see the whole population, when that's what we need if we're administering services for the whole population or doing population-wide research. But clinical registries are crucially important too. And I think they shouldn't live on different planets. And they have been working together, but I think we could do more in that regard.
Well, thanks, David. That's a very helpful comment. Now, we do have a question here from Linda Hassel, which is, how do researchers apply for access to the data sets? Is there a central location? And perhaps you can, from your experience, can provide a comment on that.
Well, you know, this comes back to the governance and the arrangements. If researchers want access to cancer data, the cancer data, let's say they live in or let's say I'll make a more difficult scenario. Let's say they live in New South Wales or Victoria, where there are cross-border flows and where people are being treated in different jurisdictions, not their own. Some of the databases are going to be located within the jurisdiction of interest. And to get access to those data, I guess if I was in their shoes, I'd be heading for the cancer registry on advice on how to get access to cancer registry data and who the data stewards are or data custodians are of all those cancer-related databases that they might want to get access to that live within Victoria. But if they have an interest in the population of Victoria, recognising that people cross the border and get treated elsewhere, recognising that some of their screening registries and vaccination registries are located at a Commonwealth level, then they have to find their way to those data custodians. And I think the access point there is the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, because they know all those sources and they're using them. And so I think they should go to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare and they say, where do I go? How can you help me? Where do I go to get these data after defining what it is? So it's really operating at those two levels. If they're working in a multi-jurisdictional environment, I guess PHRN's got a role to play there as well.
Okay, thanks, David. And of course, PHRN does have an online application system for cross-jurisdictional projects because, as you say, people live in border areas. And of course, the Australian population by its nature is quite mobile, not least with the FIFO workers sort of moving from one side of the country to the other on a pretty regular basis.
Yes.
Perhaps another question for me, David, is thinking about the value of the omics, the genomics and the other omics data. How long do you think it's going to take us to get that omics data routinely or more systematically linked?
Depends on where you live, I think. I think already registries have access or there are means of linking registry data and linked data to those data. Certainly that's the case in New South Wales and it exists in Victoria. It's early days yet, but I think, again, I'd be talking to the registry heads in those two states to say, is there a way that I can get these data linked up with the biospecimen data, for example? I know that in Victoria, the administration of the cancer registry and the administration of biospecimen databases was brought under the same roof with this in mind. So I think it's challenging the system to help you out to do this work. If there are not squeaky wheels and pressure, then the interest will go elsewhere.
Well, thanks for that, David. So I'm not seeing any other questions, and it's heading towards, well, it's heading towards 10 o'clock in Western Australia where I am, but obviously something different depending where the rest of the audience is. So David, on behalf of all of the attendees at today's webinar, thanks very much for an inspiring and thought-provoking presentation. You've certainly highlighted opportunities for further improvements in Australia's data linkage and cancer research infrastructure, and I think that's very important to all of us. So that concludes today's events. Thanks everyone for your participation.
Thank you.